If the law was making exceptions for our president, what's preventing the law from doing it again and again until the law doesn't just become the law, but it's just privilege? Hi everyone, welcome to the tianni anthology, where I'm just a teen who really likes stories, but also really likes sharing them. So I fell into a rabbit hole of United States v. Nixon, but obviously we're going to be needing some context for today's case. So let's get right into it. It's June 17th, 1972. 5 men break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C., or in shorter words, DNC. So this burglary looks like a completely ordinary burglary until you realize that it ends with the only president in American history to resign. Richard Nixon was elected the President of the United States in 1968, and by 1972 he decided to rerun for president. He ran for re-election. He was pretty popular at the time, mostly because of his foreign policy successes, like reconnecting relations with China. That's a major factor of what made him pretty popular. His re-election campaign was called the Committee for the Re-election of the President, or CRP, or as some people like to call it, CREEP. And while that sounds funny now, the people in his campaign, the things that they were doing, they weren't so funny. So their goal was to gather information on the Democratic Party and give Nixon the best possible chance of winning that re-election. So now, let's go back to June 17, 1972, which is the day that the 5 men broke into Washington, D.C. When the 5 men broke into the DNC, they were carrying cameras and bugging devices. And basically what they wanted to do was to photograph confidential documents and install hidden listening devices. And what happened was a security guard was making his nightly patrol. He saw a piece of tape on the door latch, and he went to go take it off. And then minutes later, he comes back, and that tape, it's back. So obviously that means there's someone in that room that shouldn't be. So the 5 men, they get arrested. Their names were Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, and James McCord. But honestly, the only name you really need to remember is Mr. James McCord. You need to remember him because he wasn't no ordinary burglar. He was a former CIA agent, and most importantly, the security coordinator for Nixon's new re-election campaign. So now suddenly, this didn't look like no ordinary burglary. It started to get political. So obviously the investigators, they started investigating. And at first, the White House, they obviously said the president has nothing to do with this. Our president is innocent. And a lot of Americans, they believed it. But of course, investigators kept digging. They kept digging into financial records, phone records, bank accounts, campaign connections, things like that. And once they dug deep into that, they started following the money. They followed the money and they found the cash linked back to Nixon's re-election campaign, which led back to payments connected to the CRP, CREEP. And they also found money being moved around to hide where it actually came from. And the deeper they dug, the worse it got. They uncovered attempts to hide evidence, influence witnesses, pay hush money, things like that. And they even tried to interfere with FBI investigation. So obviously, several high-ranking members in the White House, they started to get involved. But there was still one huge problem. There was no direct evidence leading Richard Nixon to that break-in on July 17th. But that was until July 16th, 1973. Almost an entire year after the break-in, everything changed. So now here we have another figure, Alexander Butterfield. One of Nixon's former deputy assistants was testifying before Congress when someone asked him a pretty, simple question. They asked him, have any conversations in the White House been recorded? It was a very simple question. Alexander Butterfield answered with yes. Because it turns out Nixon had secretly installed a recording system back in 1971. It automatically recorded conversations in the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, all those private areas where confidential conversations are being held. Once investigators found out that these tapes, the tapes of conversations being recorded, they demanded it immediately. They subpoenaed those tapes. Subpoena basically just means that the court demands that somebody bring in pieces of evidence. Like, you need to bring it in. And the person who subpoenaed these recordings was Archibald Cox. But then Cox was fired because obviously Nixon didn't want to subpoena those recordings because who knew what were in those? Now, another prosecutor, his name is Leon Jaworski, he took over and he kept pushing for those tapes. You guys might be wondering,
why do these tapes matter so much? Why do we care so much about them?
The tapes matter because if they really did exist, they could be answering the biggest questions of the case. What did Nixon know? When did he know? And was he a part of that break-in? But obviously, Nixon, he denied everything. He said, no, I wasn't a part of this. No, I did not know about this. No to every single thing. And he argued something called executive privilege. So executive privilege is the privilege that U.S. presidents and very high-ranking political officials have to withhold certain documents, evidence, recordings, things like that from like the general public for the best interest of the public. It's not a completely ridiculous thing for Nixon to argue, but there is one problem for it. If the president could withhold evidence whenever he wanted, who is going to keep him accountable? And that's exactly the question that this case wanted the country to answer at the time. Basically, his argument was that presidents, they need private conversations with their advisors. And if every conversation would end up public, would end up in court, then his advisors, they would be less inclined to speak honestly. And that would obviously make it harder for the president to do their job if their advisor isn't advising them correctly. So instead of handing over the original tapes, President Nixon, he handed over edited transcripts and summaries of those tapes. But obviously, those prosecutors, they weren't buying it. They wanted the real thing. They wanted the original tapes in its own copy, nothing edited. They wanted it now, and they subpoenaed it. And eventually, it got so serious that the Supreme Court had to answer a question of, could the president refuse to legally hand over evidence? And the answer was no. They did agree that executive privilege, it was real, it was tangible, and it should be used in cases like this. They also agreed that presidents do deserve some level of confidentiality, but that does not mean that that level is unlimited. And I think here's the reason why United States v. Nixon is still remembered today. It wasn't because of the burglary that happened. It was because of the way the law was being questioned. Because if the law was making exceptions for our president and the law was turning one blind eye away from one person, what's preventing the law from turning another blind eye away from someone else and doing it again and again until the law doesn't just become the law, but it's just privilege? I think I completely forgot to mention this, but this entire scandal thing is called the Watergate scandal. You guys can search it up over here or over here. I just completely forgot to mention it. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed my video. I don't know if you guys realized, but my dog was sitting on me this entire time. And he was just sitting on my lap and he was kind of asleep. So yeah, have a great day. Bye-bye.